Hello and welcome to a conversation on the Daily Bern. I'm your host, Eric Miller. Today I'm joined by a fierce, awesome advocate and organizer for Refuse Fascism, among many other things, Mr. Jamel Mims. Am I saying your name properly, Jamel Mims?
Yeah, you got it, Jamel Mims.
Right on. Nice to meet you, sir. And thank you for all the work that you do. I've been following Refuse Fascism and participating a little bit here and there. I'm in the Philly area. I think I first learned about it through Yusef Salam, one of the exonerated five. He was sharing it back in 2016, right? He's got a personal story, obviously, with the con man from the TV occupying the White House. But I want to ask about Refuse Fascism and how you got involved. So just talk about that. Refuse Fascism. What is it? How did you get connected with them?
So what's up, everybody? My name is Jamel Mims, aka Jam No Peanut, and I'm with the New York City Revolution Club and Refuse Fascism. And I've been an organizer with Refuse Fascism since the beginning, since 2016 and the election of Trump. And join with people, including Carl Dix and Sarah Taylor, I think Immortal Technique, a number of people who were actually part of the beginning ceremony.
Oh, I lost him. Give him a minute to rejoin. While I wait for him to jump back in, one of the focuses we're going to talk about is a couple of protests. There's one tonight at 7 p.m. in Washington, D.C. On Black Lives Matter Boulevard Plaza, which is right on 16th and 8th Street, right in front of the White House. That's tonight at 7 p.m. And then on next Saturday, September 5th, there is a nationwide effort. Refuse Fascism, and hopefully he's going to be able to jump back in here, is a national organization, but there are local chapters, and there are events happening all over the country on September 5th, the United Mass Protests. And if you go to Facebook and search Refuse Fascism, or if you go to refusefascism.org, you can find local chapters, local events. I know there's one in Philadelphia on September 5th, Boston, New York, DC. And if you search that hashtag Trump Pence out now, you can find more out about that. I'm not seeing Jamil jump back on yet. So let's give him a few. There he is.
Check. Can you guys hear me? Can you see me?
Yep, you're back.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Sorry, I don't know what happened just there. Maybe too many applications running or something. But you were asking how I got involved with Refuse Fascism. And yeah, I've been involved with Refuse Fascism since 2016, since its founding. We're really, it was a broad coalition of forces that came together to say that the Trump-Pence regime, a fascist regime, actually needs to be driven out of power, and that we need to start actually organizing to bring millions of people into the streets and day after day, night after night protests. We were looking at what happened in Egypt in Tahrir Square, looking at this as a model for how you actually topple and drive out a hated regime. And so as early as then started to actually call for that. But yeah, I got, organized, back in 2016 with Refuse Fascism.
Right on. Can you go into that? So what did you, it's interesting that you looked at Egypt and I guess probably the green movement in Iran and things like that. What did you learn? Like, what are some sort of strategic or tactical takeaways as an organizer that you picked up from seeing what was going on elsewhere in the world in terms of frontline fighting fascism?
Yeah, I mean, look, as part of that, and even before that, I was part of organizing with the Stop Mass Incarceration Network and with Carl Dix, who's a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, who joined with Cornel West to actually take on the policy of stop and frisk, in New York City. And so through a series of civil disobedience actions, we were actually going to different precincts. And this opened up kind of a cleave in society around this question of mass incarceration, which there had been a lot of research around, but actually not a lot of, action on the streets. And this is a very different time before the initial wave of like Black Lives Matter protests in 2014. This was around like 2011 and 12. And so that's kind of the backdrop that, in terms of how I was thinking and moving in that space. And as part of those conversations around 2012, you had the situation that broke out in Egypt, where Mubarak, hated dictator who had ruled for, 25 plus years, was driven out by people in the streets day after day, night after night, refusing to go home, looking at, they began at kind of like that occupying political square. And I remember attending programming at Revolution Books and talking to artists and graffiti artists who were actually part of bringing art and culture to part of that movement. Talking with also and doing panels and talking about what are the best remedies for tear gas, and between what's going on in Egypt and what's going on in Ferguson. And so this was a lot of the backdrop in terms of like how we were organizing, again, this under the Obama presidency, and then 2016 with the rise of Trump. And it's so much more evident 3.5 years later, where there's really the sharpness of what this actual regime is actually capable of. I don't think any of us thought that we'd be having to guard ourselves from counter protesters running us down in the streets or trying to mow us down with guns. I don't think any of us thought we would like live through like a Muslim ban or children in concentration camps. So it's so much worse than we even imagined. But a lot of the insights that really came from that period was really relying on the people themselves, to actually push and broaden out what is actually possible, how that can actually transform the political and reshape the entire political terrain, how that crucial missing factor, between ruling parties as they're duking it out, the crucial missing factor of millions on the street can actually reset the terms of all of that. And I think that was a real central lesson and a crucial orientation where we stepped into, both with the understanding of looking at this regime as actually fascist and that fascism has direction and momentum. It reshapes and remakes law, and that the way you actually have to drive that out, it can be voted in. And it's voted in by, it subverts elections and gets in by democratic means. But, you actually can't vote it out. You have to drive it out. And so these are some crucial understandings that came forward from like both looking at that period and a lot of work done by like Bob Avakian to actually look at this question of fascism as it's been rising, Christian fascism in the United States over the past 20 years. So in a nutshell, that's kind of like, some of the broader lessons learned from it and how it actually applies. But I think things here right now are sharpening up in an incredibly intense way.
Yeah, no doubt. But it's an important point to be made that that it's a long arc of this rise. You mentioned Christian fascism, right-wing fascism, right? The fascistic media, that's state-run media, right? It's all an arc, and Trump is a bit of the head of it, right? So it's not, obviously he's the focus, right? But if we got rid of him, like you said, it's there's, you didn't say neoliberalism, but there's sort of a duopoly, right? That still has these fascistic things. There's classism, all that stuff, right? But obviously, that requires more of a multi-pronged approach in terms of media, in terms of electoral politics, et cetera, et cetera. But what you're talking about is in the streets, right? Driving it out, which has a lot more urgency, right? And it sucks that we're to this point. You say that no one saw this coming, but I'm going to disagree with you. I think a lot of us saw this coming in 2016. That's why everyone got on board with Refuse Fascism and the like, right? I think we were screaming from the rooftops that this is coming, right? And kind of we're here now. The example yesterday, I'm preaching to the choir, the protests in Kenosha, right? With this, this murderer, the shooter, the counter protester. I'm not even going to give him that credit, but the thing about that's a real dagger in the brain for me is, he was an aspiring police officer. So he traveled out of state and did this. Presumably, I'm speculating here, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but presumably he did this in part to impress the police officers that he was welcomed by, right? So I mean, that's just fucking maddening, right? I'm preaching to the choir, but talk about your thoughts over the last 24, 48 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting the nail right on the head, like both between the collusion between these state forces and, the out of state white nationalists, what used to be called lone wolves, but now have a real concrete name. These are white supremacist terrorists. They have a concrete agenda, that actually rallies behind this Make America Great Again agenda. It rallies behind the defense of Confederate statues. It actually upholds that history. This is actually a concrete thing. And for many, many years, it was just, school shootings to Dylan Roof, right, are all seen as these atomized events. But this is actually a cohesive and coherent movement. And you see it right now being whipped up like brown shirts would have been in Hitler's Germany in Trump's America. And so, it is, look, I remember 2016 in New York City, and it was the quietest day on the subway ever, right? Where there's a way that I think people knew that things would be bad, right? But the expectation of what would actually occur, and how Trump would actually rule as an overt fascist white supremacist, I don't think, anyone would have expected. And and as far as Refuse Fascism, look, we had been, and folks had been, to use the analogy you're saying, preaching to the choir, people at the choir had been listening, but no one had been singing. And so for 3.5 years, and I think it was described by this quote from William Butler Yeats of like, those lacking conviction, to paraphrase, those lacking conviction are silent, and those with the most vitriol are filled with like passionate hatred. They're just basically those. It was a lot of very good people in the middle, right, who were kind of doing nothing, and then you see this explosion that actually happens, around Black Lives Matter, and following the coronavirus pandemic. And so this past situation, these past couple of months, this past 5 months or so, has been like a unique situation where people have actually been stepping out into the streets. But there is a real difference between how folks have been stepping out into the streets and what's needed to actually drive out this regime. Like, look, this movement is actually at a crossroads right now that frankly won't advance and may be thrown back in horrendous ways if Trump and Pence are not removed from power now. And the incidents you're talking about in Kenosha over the past couple of days really bring this sharply into light. Like, look at the side by side of, Jacob Blake, father, gunned down in the back 7 times, paralyzed, in urgent condition, can never walk again, right? For the crime of refusing to, obey police officers' orders, right? Gunned down for that. Who clarified that there was actually a weapon in his car, right, in the floorboard, right? You see that happen. He gets gunned down at point blank range with like callousness and cruelty. You see cheerleaders come up and say, that all of that was completely justified. People take the streets. I mean, first of all, this happened after people had been taking the streets for months in a beautiful and heroic upsurge and uprising in 2,000 American cities and towns and places where there, frankly, are no Black people that are saying Black Lives Matter. All right. Yeah. After all that, this still happens. And then in the course of that, you have the RNC, which then it upholds people, like the McClotskys, who were the St. Louis couple who people saw who pulled automatic weapons on Black Lives Matter protesters. It upholds them as heroes, and not 36 hours before Kyle Rittenhouse travels interstate to go and gun down Black Lives Matter protesters, does Trump say at the RNC that our people, our Second Amendment people, would have taken care of Portland in a day? Like, come on. This is actually what fascism does. It has movement and direction. It unleashes these brown shirts as part of intimidating people and as part of trying to push people out of the streets, right? And trying to impart law and order, but the law and order of fascism. And so this is a real moment and a real crossroads where this movement has to confront. If it's going to advance, it has to go through the Trump-Pence regime and driving them out. This is not something the Black Lives Matter movement can sidestep or something that's ancillary to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not possible for it to hijack the agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement, because going to demonstrate, I think people have illusions that they think you'll be able to demonstrate as normal or at all under a fascist Trump-Pence second term where this shit has totally consolidated. It'll look a lot more like what's happening in Kenosha. And frankly, a lot more of those kinds of folks being pulled out of the woodwork. We have to actually drive this out now.
Yeah, well, that's ominous and real and looming, right? I want to get more into that sort of that crossroads that we're facing in November, but I do want to highlight the events that are coming up, right? So this is why we're talking today. Specifically, you have I'll just cue you up. Tell me what's coming up.
Yeah, this slide is awesome, man. Took the words right out of my mouth. But today, this Thursday, we have a protest, and we're calling for people to come down to DC, to get on a bus, get on a seaplane, get on a chartered vehicle, figure it out. Right? There's actually a contingent that's biking down Thursday, August 27th. 7 p.m. We'll be at Black Lives Matter Plaza, and this is to protest Trump's, Trump's acceptance speech at this Republican National Convention, aka this like virtual Nuremberg town hall, right? And then you can join our contingent tomorrow at the Get Your Knee Off Our Necks March, the Trump-Pence Out Now contingent at the Get Your Knee Off Our Necks March on August 28th, on Friday. And this is leading into nationwide demonstrations on September 5th, right? Where around the country, in cities and towns around the country, where we have to be on a mission to actually inspire and electrify people and actually, make a commitment to driving this regime out through 60 days of unrelenting action going forward, right? And so September 5th is really a kickoff, and it's really the start of really saying like, look, we are here to drive this Trump and Pence regime out.
Right on. So that starts September 5th, and then daily through November 3rd is the intent, right? And that, while you were off there, I was talking a bit about the organization of Refuse Fascism. As I understand it, there's a national group, but then there's a lot of chapters in cities, and there are events happening in various cities. I know there's one in Philly, in Boston, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about just the footprint of all this nationally?
Yeah, so Refuse Fascism, if you're interested in Refuse Fascism, go to refusefascism.org. Like this is it's an organization of people from all over. I'll try to keep it within here, from all over. My hands are going much wider than this, but it's from all political spectrums, from folks who were down with revolutionary communism like myself, to people who were down for Bernie and AOC, to people who are caping for Biden and Kamala, for anyone that recognizes the need, and for any GOP members who suddenly grew a heart, right? For anybody that recognizes the fundamental need to drive this fascist regime out and what that actually requires, right? Not depending or relying on these elections, right? But actually relying on the movement and motion of millions in the streets, right? For anybody who knows that they need to be driven out, Refuse Fascism is the organization for you. And Out Now is something that everybody at every organization, as they are, needs to actually take up, right? No progressive agenda is going to move forward under a second term fascist Trump-Pence regime, under the second coming of the Confederacy, right? Every single progressive movement is going to be set back by that. So we all need to be carrying up the banner of Trump-Pence Out Now. And so, the actions that are taking place at Union Square in New York City on September 5th, you have in Atlanta and Chicago, Honolulu, Hawaii, Los Angeles, Bay Area. We have a Yonkers chapter up in New York, DC. And so Philly, as you were saying, but you can go into refusefascism.org to take a look at the actions that have been called for thus far, and then you can also set up your own action, right? and start a Refuse Fascism chapter near you if you aren't nearby.
Right on. Yeah, and there's you also have a mechanism to donate, so you can financially support it if you're not able or within range of any of these events, right? There are other ways that you can help, right? You can share it, you can promote it, share this video, right? Spread the word, get out in the streets. Yeah, I think it's incredible and critical. So let's talk about just a little bit how you see this potentially unfolding, and this is a bit speculative, right? So we had this crossroads in November, electorally speaking, or January, right? So he wins, he loses, right? How do you see each of those unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, this is a heavy question, man, and they're very, in the times that we're in, like, look, this is someone who's already very clearly said, even since his impeachment, has already very clearly identified his intentions to tamper with the elections, has already laid the ground to cheat and subvert the elections. The rule of law from the Supreme, on the basis of that impeachment was that, that frankly, that Trump is the law, and that in his duties as the president in representing the United States, he can actually do no harm to the United States nor be prosecuted for it. And so, he's actually completely greased the ground. And I think, then both in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, 150,000 plus, already dead and perished from that, and with this question over mail-in ballots has already started to literally remove, not just take dollars out of the post office and defund the post office, but literally remove mailboxes off of the corners, right? Craziness. And give differing messages between, it's mail-in voting is acceptable here, absentee voting is a fraud over here, in neighboring and or adjoining states. This is actually part of how they're actually advancing their overall program through chaos, in a similar way that, that fascist Germany actually advanced things after the Reichstag fire, right? And so we're actually seeing, someone who's already said that even if I don't get it, I won't leave, right? We'll see, right? Who's openly called forward white supremacists like Kyle Rittenhouse and others, right, to actually actively defend and poll watchers, right? Right, to go into these cities already, sending federal troops into these cities to go and vote. Their tactics are extreme white supremacy and voter suppression, right? Unlike anything that we've actually ever seen. I think it's impossible to say, and there's so many factors, it's impossible to say exactly what will happen. But look, if we simply rely on these elections and wait to vote into November, when he's already said it could take years to even figure out who the results of this election is. He's already said that if I don't win this thing, it's a fraud, it's a sham, right? And he's already called out an armed force and armed militias to actually back and defend that. And so I think we will see a lot of different showdowns at the polls, right? Where he's actually ordered and called for these poll watchers, this ex-military and ex-police poll watchers, the very people that people have been out in the streets in the face of, calling them to defend the elections. I mean, come on. As well as in the process of that, you'll continue to have, I think, the ways that this system cannot stop oppressing and brutalizing Black and brown people, cannot stop despoiling the environment, right? Cannot stop treating women as second-class citizens, and cannot care for the basic health of people during the coronavirus pandemic and housing of people, right? So on top of that, you have a looming housing crisis, right? And these continued convulsions that'll continue to happen as as officers continue to slaughter and maim Black and brown people. And so it'll be a very tumultuous road between here and there. I think that's guaranteed. And it's guaranteed that if we wait to vote, then we're already both ceding ground and losing ground. Now, if, what's clear is there needs to be a resounding defeat for Trump at the polls and through these elections in November. There has to be that, right? Yeah. And, even Bob Avakian, Revolutionary Communist, has even called for that, right? This is like unprecedented, right? But at the same time, if we rely and wait on those elections, then we're actually dead in the water. There has to be a movement starting now to drive people out in the way that they did in Egypt, in Korea, in Lebanon over a weekend. There has to be a movement now that actually begins to take ground. As people have been out in the streets chanting Black Lives Matter, yes, but we need to actually link up the struggle that Black Lives Matter will not exist under the fascist Trump and Pence regime. And we have to actually drive them out in order to make Black Lives Matter, and in order to even begin that process, frankly. And so that people have to be out in the streets in the millions in the course of that. And for us to even get a shot at being able to force Trump out, that's the kind of circumstance that we're in. Even if he loses the election, right? There will already have to be a force that's in society that's pushing him out. Because if he loses, who is going to come to actually defend that? They're already training this other side, and they're already opening up a civil war. Right. And a one-sided civil war is a genocide. Right. Yeah. And so that's a number of different kinds of scenarios or ways that it can play out. But the urgency around getting people out in the streets as a fundamental and critical thing that needs to be done now in order to present the most favorable conditions, not just to drive Trump out, but to emancipate all of humanity, is something that has to be done.
Right on. Yeah, right there with you. Let me ask two sort of follow-up questions, and then I'll let you go, and we'll promote the events again. September 5th is the national one, so that's the biggie. And I have a few more guests coming on from Refuse Fascism right before that, so I'll be awesome. Get the word out. You mentioned the Reichstag fire, right? So there's actually, maybe I'll tie these two questions into one, right? So I think anyone that is aware of that has kind of been waiting for some inciting incident like that, right? However, it's been a series of paper cuts, right? It's a slow burn. It's not a single incident, right? And you might look at George Floyd as a bit of an inciting incident because that inspired more protests, more Black Lives Matter people in the streets, and from their perspective, cynically, it's a slow burn Reichstag fire. They're getting that inspires this. The white nationalist terrorists getting out in the streets, right? So, while we were waiting for like a single spark, it's been this ever-growing burn over the last 3.5 years, but definitely over this summer, right? Mm-hmm. So my question in that is, as an organizer, and we all fight this fight, like how do you overcome apathy, right? So you have people that maybe they see themselves as good people. They go to church, whatever. They just, politics isn't for me, right? They don't fully follow the news cycle. You and I are political junkies. A lot of people are not, right? So how do you get people off the sidelines? How do you, sort of wake them up, splash of cold water, without having that singular Reichstag fire inciting incident that you can explain? How do you overcome apathy? I'm sure as an organizer, this is something you see every day of your life and your work. How do you do that? Any tips?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question. And I think, this thing on both overcoming apathy and how fascism actually has worked. Like, look, there were people flooding the airports at the top of them at the first Muslim ban. By Muslim ban version 2 and Muslim ban version 3, now we have a more or less total immigration ban.
It's exhausting.
Right? Where there was frankly no response, no public or mass response to that, right? This is how, how you're saying, like a death by 1,000 cuts, right? This is actually, or, the concept of a frog being boiled alive and not knowing what temperature it's actually in, right? It is a concept of them, hammering at, and how fascism moves is it can kind of obliterate through different obstacles and attack so many different fronts at the same time that it does exactly like you're saying. It gets exhausting. It gets overwhelming to deal with, right? People start to cede ground on what they thought was unacceptable the day prior. They start to cede ground and give up to, right? And this is actually its motion and its direction, and part of how it gathers momentum and strength. I think the thing that's been inspiring for me has really been what's come out of over the past 5 months, and seeing unprecedented demonstrations. Places like Portland, where walls of moms and walls of vets are taking tear gas canisters and, leaf blowers. These are like very Saturday morning cartoon picket fence, grandpas coming out with leaf blowers to say, no, I bought this from Home Depot to go blow away some tear gas. They're, seeing K-pop stands who are actually like, going online to go and troll Donald Trump ceremonies, falsify the information for tickets, pry information to the other side, and give information to, our side. I think there are a lot of these new developments, the NBA, altogether halting,
Right.
Milwaukee Bucks stepping down, going from taking a knee to saying, we're not playing any of this. LeBron James tweeting out, fuck this. We need change. It's tremendously inspiring, I think, to see people all around actually come together for this and break away formerly ossified divisions. Some of these formerly, to step out of this stewy mess of identity politics and, this is how white allies should play this game, and this is how Black leadership should play this game, and say, fuck all that. We all need to be out on the streets, seeing these like beautiful, diversity of people who are actually taking personal responsibility for this has been something that's been tremendously inspiring, and I think seeing things like what has happened in Lebanon, all right, has actually shown, okay, there is actually a process to do this, right? And actually a strategy that we can employ. But I think the main thing that, in terms of like avoiding or in terms of apathy is for me comes from the orientation that things fundamentally actually do not have to be this way, right? That this actually comes from a system, not from human nature or not from some eternal way that things are, right? But it actually comes from the fact that things actually do not have to be this way, and that you actually need a revolution to overthrow this system. And that's been done in history before too. And we need to learn from the examples of that, right? And so that, frankly, for me, in terms of dealing with apathy, that's the main thing I stay connected to with it. But it's, over the past 5-6 months has been tremendously inspiring.
Awesome. Yeah, and personally, you always need a little bit of downtime, right, to coalesce and convalesce rather, and heal and get back into the fight. So, Jamel, I think the work you do is awesome, and I love Refuse Fascism. Let's just throw this up again one more time. So tonight in DC, next Saturday around the country, go to refusefascism.org. That hashtag Trump Pence out now is an active and a live one. So, get engaged on that. And if you just search Refuse Fascism, you'll find all kinds of resources and local chapters. And like he was saying, there's no reason you can't start your own chapter just because there isn't one there. You can be the trailblazer, right? So,
yep, definitely.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to chat with you again, Jamil, after, this, there are other battles to be had. So, I'll talk to you again, hopefully in the future. I'd love to have you come back. Like I said, I think the work you do is critical and vital to, preserving this country of ours. And, without it, the alternative is just flat out not acceptable. Right. We don't have a choice really. So, I admire your work, and thanks for taking some time to chat with me and, sharing your story and some tips and things like that. I look forward to speaking with you again. I'll see you out on the streets, at least on September 5th. I won't be out tomorrow, but I'll be out on the 5th. So,
thanks again so much.
Fight. Thank you, man. Talk to you soon.
All right. Talk soon. Thanks for having me on. Welcome back anytime, man.
Right on.